So good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you for today's session. This is session number 3 as part of this conclave. I think we're off to a flying start, and I'm sure that it's only going to get better. We are going to talk about cyber infrastructure and big data analytics or big data computing. Now, it's fairly clear how they are connected. I mean, the game is obviously to do as good as possible data analysis, data analytics using big data. And eventually and inevitably, you will find the need for a supporting and an enabling infrastructure. So I think when the organizers decided to call it cyber infrastructure and big data analytics, I presume we are going to talk about how one works or one feeds off the other. It's widespread. I think there's lots of things we can talk about. We do have a great panel. We do have great participants. So I'm sure it's going to be an exciting 2.5 hours. Let me start by, the process as we followed in the past is that we start with the main speaker. And today is going to be Dr. Vasant Gajanan Honavar. A little bit of an introduction very quickly because we'd rather hear him talk than hear about him because, so he's the Edward Frymoyer Endowed Professor at Penn State. Expertise or interest is largely in computational and data science. The key words that you might think of when you hear about him first would probably be bioinformatics and genomics, machine learning, causal inference, artificial intelligence. Okay, these are things that he has worked on, he cares for. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And earlier, right from Bangalore here, he has his BE in electronics engineering from the BMS College. And I think amongst other things, the number that I found most staggering was that he has actually guided 34 PhDs so far. I think that's a remarkable number. I wonder how many can do that. If I look back and see how many I've guided, I find one. And I'm sure I'm not going to find any more. So it's a pleasure, it's a delight to have Dr. Honavar with us. And may I suggest that you please take over. Good morning. So we can see your slide, Dr. Honavar. Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, sir. We can.
All right. So let me just get started. So I work with lots of people.
Oh, we see the faces now. Good.
Many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about is the result of, those collaborations, and many have contributed, and I'm not going to list them all right now because there's no time. Okay, so if you fall asleep during this talk, here's the summary slide. So and I'm going to essentially go over this. And basically, it's this idea. So we've all heard about big data. So I'm going to put a little bit of a damper on it. I'm going to sort of make the case that big data is necessary for advancing many of the fields that we care about, from life sciences to health or many of these application areas, but it's not enough. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, so the rest of the talk is going to be essentially about explaining why it's not enough, and maybe a little bit about what we might do about it. Okay? So, okay. So, big data. Well, what has led to this so-called big data? Well, it's largely our instruments of observation have become increasingly sophisticated. We can store more and more information, so we can communicate. We can send it around, and all of this has led to this exponential growth in the volume and the velocity and variety of data. Okay. So, but big data is not new. Big data has been around. Okay, it's been around a long time, even though we might not have called it big data. Right? Big data started at least as far back as 2400 BC. The first libraries were built in Babylonia. And then the largest data collection was the Library of Alexandria in Egypt until the Romans destroyed it. And the first recorded data analysis, what we now call machine learning maybe, but not done using computers, was done in 1663 by John Grant, who was interested in sort of stopping the spread of plague in Europe. And magnetic storage was invented. And then first digital computers were built. And then one of the first data center, now there are all these big data centers that get established by Amazon and IBM and various others, Google. The first data center was planned essentially for processing and storing information from tax returns. IRS was the first data center. And then came the relational databases, internet got developed. And somewhere around 1996, digital storage became cheaper than paper. Okay, and so that made it possible to store lots and lots of data in digital form. And with the web and digital storage that was networked, many of them text documents, Google and others came up with this idea of search engines, and then it sort of took off, right? And somewhere in 2015, the numbers suggest that in 2 years, 2014-15, as much data was created as the sum total of everything that was created in entire recorded history. And then it's just taken off, right? So that's big data. So first observation, it's not new. It's been always the case, and big is relative. And we've had big data for a long time. Okay. So now, in modern times, we have big data in many different areas. So here's just one example. In health sciences, you can measure all kinds of things about humans at different scales. And you want to understand how the living organisms function. You want to understand disease. You want to come up with new medicines. So there's big data in health sciences, right? Similar thing if you're trying to understand the brain. There were many things that we couldn't even measure even 10 or 20 years ago, but there are now increasingly sophisticated ways of measuring things in brain, all the way from molecular level to the entire organism, and even interacting brains in social networks. Right? And that's just two examples. The same thing is happening in virtually every area of human endeavor. So each one of you is a walking sensor, if you will. If you carry a cell phone, you are a sensor. Your signals are being where you are, what websites you visited, what you bought. Everything is being recorded, right? For what purpose, good or bad, right? It's being recorded. So there's this amazing amount of data being collected. So there's a promise of big data. So there's a hope that big data would allow us to understand complex systems, cells, brains, individuals, organizations, societies. It would help us improve health, anticipating and responding to crises of various kinds, personalizing teaching and learning, defending critical infrastructure, making decisions, public policy, improving public policy, making cities and communities better, improving food, energy, and water security, maybe improving democratic processes, and so on, so on. Okay, so just more importantly, in scientific disciplines, right? Data acquisition, which used to be the bottleneck in many sciences, is no longer the bottleneck. So one example is, life sciences, and this is a slide that I got from Larry Hunter. So, the train here is the data, and the boy on the bicycle is a scientist trying to, sort of survive, right? So the picture sort of represents, it's a metaphor for what's going on. So we are close to, and we already have $1,000 genome sequence, but analyzing that data, what it means, might take us $1 million to interpret it. There are thousands of databases in life sciences alone, and more than 1 million new biomedical journal articles are published a year. And this figure is already old. Okay, so that's the volume of data. So you can imagine if you are a scientist in even a limited field, a very specialized field, in order for you to stay on top of literature, it's nearly impossible without sophisticated informatics tools to help you. Okay. So data processing is also, for the most part, I mean, this is not entirely true, but for the most part, is not the rate limiting step in science. And most of these recent advances, particularly in the last 10 years or so, have made tremendous strides in data management, various aspects of it, organizing data, indexing data, integrating data, storing, querying, and even analytics like machine learning, data integration. So this has led many to kind of suggest that with this emergence of big data, we don't really need theories. We can just look at large amounts of data, look at correlations. We can stop looking for models. We can analyze the data without hypothesis. And essentially, we can throw these numbers into biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen, and let statistical algorithms like machine learning algorithms find patterns where science cannot. Okay, and in some sense, this is also the thesis. Again, not the entire thesis, but part of the thesis of the fourth paradigm idea, right? That came out of folks at Microsoft Research. So I want to sort of maybe make you to pause and think about it a little bit. Okay, so we have these big data sets, and you can find all kinds of correlations in these data. There are thousands of variables, millions of data points. You can take any variable and correlate with any other, and you will find a correlation. So here's a correlation of global average temperature. There's a website where you can plug in any variables that you care about and try to get correlations. So this came from there. So there's a almost perfect correlation between the number of pirates attacks in the sea and global average temperature. So, if you believe this, and if you sort of take the correlation literally, if you want to fight global warming, you should become a pirate. Okay. So big data is not the end of theory. Correlation is not causation. Most of you know that. Here's another one. So this is a graph of science funding in the United States and deaths by suicide and hanging. Okay. So now suppose, you look at this slide, and this is not something that I made up. This is actually true. So if you give this data to somebody that doesn't quite know the difference between correlation and causation, that person might be tempted to say that if you want to reduce deaths by suicide and hanging, you just cut off all science funding. Okay. And this sort of debate is not so far-fetched. In fact, you see many, many articles in popular literature that essentially take correlation and jump to this, conclusion that there is something causal behind that. Okay. All right. So hopefully you see that that's a problem. And there is almost a crisis in the scientific literature, right? So John Ioannidis published an article a few years ago saying why most published research findings are false. And of course, there is similar things about, the parable of Google flu trends. So basically all of these, and this is not because scientists are deliberately trying to mislead the public or there is just some malicious intent there, but most of the time it's data that's being analyzed and often without taking into account the story behind the data, many of the things that led to the data, that define the data generation process or the data gathering process, and without paying attention to it, you just analyze the data, you will draw maybe misleading conclusions, such as the couple that we saw before, right? So are big data and powerful computers all we need for understanding complex systems? And so for example, if you want to understand how a complex network of genes orchestrates development, aging, and disease, or you want to understand how brain structure impacts brain function and behavior. And there's a very interesting paper that I would recommend to you. It's by Jonas and Cording. And the title of the paper is, Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor? So they went through an interesting experiment, okay? So you give the wiring diagram of a microprocessor, the computer. And so essentially to someone, and do everything with this microprocessor that you would do if you were a brain scientist studying the brain. So you can look at the wiring diagram. You can, so in other words, what's connected to what? You can measure activities, electrical signals from every transistor in the microprocessor. You can look at the correlations between the activations of these transistors. And you, analogous to whole brain recording, you record from the entire microprocessor. And you're given the entire wiring diagram of this. We know quite a lot about how microprocessors function, but then you ask yourself whether you could reconstruct what this microprocessor actually is doing by all these measurements. Okay, the answer is no. And so basically, if you took a data analysis approach to all of these measurements from the microprocessor, you would have very little idea of what the microprocessor is doing. So this should be a wake-up call for us. So big data, in this case, the measurements from the microprocessor did not let us understand what a microprocessor is doing. You needed something more. And in fact, so if you want to think about this, maybe we should look at one of the first big data sciences in history, right? Physics. So how did physics come about? So Tycho Brahe gathered 20 years of extremely accurate astronomical measurements, which was made possible by the invention of telescopes, right? So about positions of stars and planets. It was big data of his time. Johannes Kepler, who was working with Tycho Brahe, took this data and fit, data in every possible way, right? And essentially what he did was big data analytics or machine learning. So he was trying to fit all kinds of complex models to this data until he found something that fits. But then if he had stopped there, we wouldn't have had physics. It took Isaac Newton and Leibniz to invent calculus, which for the first time provided a language to express things like rates of change, and which allowed us to define things like velocity and acceleration. And that led to the physics, Newtonian physics, which served us well for over 200 years, and it still serves us quite well. So big data, the planetary motion data that was gathered at that time, did not make the scientific method obsolete then, and it does not do so now, right? So we need more than data. So what automation of big data acquisition, management, and analytics has done for us is to accelerate, right? Accelerate by orders of magnitude Brahe's part of the scientific endeavor, which was data acquisition and data management. Okay, that's what Tycho Brahe did. He acquired this data and he collected it and he organized it. And thanks to advances in machine learning increasingly, we have accelerated Kepler's part of the scientific endeavor. So we can do model fitting, we can do all kinds of analysis on this data. We can fit more increasingly complex models to this data. You can do deep learning, you can do all kinds of things. Okay. But for the most part, all of this leaves untouched the other aspects of science, which now become the rate limiting steps in science. At one point, when we didn't have the ability to acquire this data, we said data acquisition is the bottleneck that's holding back science. And then until about 10 years ago, we said, well, we don't know how to process this data fast enough. We need all kinds of fancy tricks to do machine learning and at scale, and we need Hadoop, and we need MapReduce, and we need these big clusters so we can process this data faster and faster. So now we have done that. But does that mean that we have accelerated science? The answer is no, because science involves many other steps. And when you have this kind of a long workflow with many different steps, if it's a linear chain or a cycle of some kind, then the whole process is as slow as the slowest step in the pipeline. Okay. There are many other steps in science that are as slow as ever. Okay. So I would argue that that's what we have to pay attention to. And in some sense, we have to kind of recapitulate what Newton's physics did for many of the sciences, that are not physics. So essentially, we have to use computation as a language, a lingua franca, that plays a role that's similar to what calculus played in physics for many of the sciences that we are interested in. Because algorithms can be used as theory. So in some sense, when you're interested in sort of understanding how a protein folding happens, you have a linear sequence of amino acids that somehow magically folds up into a three-dimensional structure. So the question is, can you come up with an algorithm that takes a linear sequence of amino acids and produces from it a description of 3D structure of the protein? If you can do that, you understand protein folding at some level. Right? So basically, algorithms can be used as theories. And then maybe you can go one step further, because for the most part, almost all of scientific endeavor is about acquiring, organizing, and integrating, analyzing information, right? Which is basically various kinds of information-bearing artifacts, data sets, hypotheses, theories, experiments, so experimental designs. So these are all information-containing artifacts. And to the extent that this is the business of science, in fact, to a large extent also of the humanities, informatics, so the science of information processing, has a fundamental role to play in accelerating scientific discovery. Okay, so big data is necessary but not sufficient. Big data is not the end of scientific method. And the journey from philately to physics, so stamp collecting, which is maybe a way to refer to data collection. It was said that all science is either stamp collecting or physics, and many sciences are still closer to stamp collecting because they focus on data collection. And advances in big data have made it possible to collect exquisitely beautiful, enormous stamp collections. They're beautiful. You have to work really hard to organize it and analyze it and so on. But you don't get physics from that. You don't get a scientific understanding of what goes on. And that requires actually computational abstractions of scientific domains and infrastructure for accelerating science, so-called cyber infrastructure. Okay. So maybe it's useful to, when we think about the infrastructure for doing this, it's useful to think about a cartoon of the scientific method. Of course, I don't want to suggest that this is the scientific method. That's not true. I mean, it sort of varies from discipline to some extent. So for example, in cosmology, you cannot run a controlled experiment. In evolution, you can not run a controlled experiment, but take this as a cartoon, right? It describes many scientific disciplines. So you start with, you have to start somewhere. Let's say you start with observation, you collected data, your big data. You can do some machine learning and you get some sort of a predictive model. And somehow we have accelerated these two parts. We know how to collect data fast. We know how to build some sort of a predictive model, usually using machine learning, black box models. But everything else here, right, still is bottlenecked as ever, So if you want to, sort of design cyber infrastructure for accelerating science, you now have to focus on some of these bottlenecked steps in scientific discovery. Okay, so this is not a new idea. Ross King's group in Edinburgh, when he was at Edinburgh, I think he's moved around since then, tried to kind of take a very specific narrow domain in yeast biology and tried to basically automate every step in the scientific process, all the way from experiment design to data collection to data analysis and hypothesis generation and so on. There's this robot scientist project, and they achieved some interesting results, but in a very narrow domain. So, but we are not really that close to automating science, despite all the advances that we talked about, right, in big data analysis. And part of the reason is, in reality, it may be the case that complete automation of science may take a long while. But in the meantime, you can think about human-machine systems that work together with the cyber infrastructure automating the things that we know how to automate well with machines, and people working side by side with machines to do what they're good at. In order to do that, you need to create at the same time computational abstractions of basically universes of scientific discourse. By that I mean, if you have to have computational abstractions of, if you're interested in biology, genetic networks, and at many different cells and genes and genetic sequences, and all of these digital representations of those, and ways to manipulate them in a systematic way. And you also need computational abstractions of scientific artifacts. By scientific artifacts, I mean everything that we create through a scientific process: data sets, hypotheses, theories, models of various kinds, connecting the models to data sets, scientific process, going from a data set to a model, going from a model to a hypothesis, going from a hypothesis to an experiment design. Every step in the scientific discovery, right? And in order to do this, you also need tools that in some ways augment and extend human intellect. So in a way, it is like not that different from a telescope or a microscope, basically, except those devices augment and extend your perceptual abilities. Here we are interested in augmenting and extending human cognitive abilities. So in domains like biology, which I mentioned earlier, when you have 1 million articles being published every year, you need cognitive tools to get your, somehow synthesize that information, help you synthesize that information and give you the right information at the right time. And so then you need collaborative human-machine infrastructure for science. Okay, so, and why would anybody attempt this? The starting point for this comes from Church-Turing thesis. That is essentially anything that can be computed using a Turing machine, and anything that can be described can, in theory, be described using a computer program, right? Finite descriptions of systematic descriptions that can be interpreted in a systematic way. So, so in any domain of scientific discourse, we need computational abstractions that describe the relevant things. You know, it may be genes, it may be proteins, it may be genetic networks, it may be brains, it may be neurons, right? And you can do this at multiple levels. So here's sort of a cartoon. I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's sort of, you know, you have to pick something. And in this case, I picked something that I'm familiar with, biology. So here's a tiny network of genes. So it's the sort of story that you might find in a molecular biology textbook or an article. So there's 4 genes that code for 4 proteins, and A and B form a complex that activates the expression of gene C. Protein C inhibits the expression of and co-regulates genes B and D. Protein D is necessary for transcription of protein B. So this is kind of the picture. This is the verbal story behind it. So this is a biological entity that we have described here. Okay, so you could go from this to a computational abstraction, a protein network, where the nodes represent proteins, edges represent interactions like binding, and then you have a computational abstraction of the real thing, which is the genetic network on the left, by something completely a digital artifact, you know, completely a mathematical abstraction that can be processed in a computer. And you can ask a number of interesting questions. You can do topological analysis on it. You can look at connected components. You can compare the topological structure and learn a lot of things. You can go one step further, a different computational abstraction of the same thing, where you have directed arrows between those. Nodes correspond to genes, edges correspond to regulatory interactions now, and edge labels can be used to indicate whether the regulation is positive or negative. And then you can you know, look at basically directed paths in this network to figure out the influences. So can some gene potentially have some effect on some other gene? The answer is yes, if there is a path from one node to the other following these arrows in this graph, right? You can go one step further and put some Boolean functions on these nodes and use them to model exactly how you know, the states of some genes influence the states of other genes. Okay, so, or you can go all the way to differential equations that relate their expression levels in a quantitative way. And what I just ran through is 4 different computational abstractions of the same thing, right? The same underlying physical reality. And each one of these is an abstraction of the other. So the Boolean representation is an abstraction of this set of differential equations. The directed graph is an abstraction of the Boolean network. The undirected graph is an abstraction of the directed graph. So it's a hierarchy of models with different amounts of detail. Okay, so so that's the sort of exercise one has to go through, and then you can ask yourself, what kind of cyber infrastructure do we really need in order to facilitate that at scale, with hundreds of scientists operating together, building these abstractions, using experimental data, and you know, and use machines to conduct some of the experiments and so on. So here's a list of some things, right? So and almost everything that you can create through a scientific process is listed in scientific artifacts. Everything that you do in the course of doing science is listed under scientific process. So scientific process involves designing, prioritizing, planning, executing, documenting, and replicating experiments. So experiment should have a digital representation. How to, you know, the process for designing experiments has to have a digital representation that can be replicated, that can be shared, that can be modified as you would any sort of digital artifact. You have to have a process for acquiring, organizing data, recording its provenance, recording the conditions under which it was acquired in a standardized vocabulary so that it can be replicated again. Building, evaluating, and linking models that you construct, generating and ranking conjectures, testing hypotheses, pretty much everything that we do in science. Right? And each one of those, right, now becomes an interesting problem in computer science. So you have to have techniques for building models from data. Yes, we have machine learning, but machine learning produces mostly black box models. If you wanted these models to be useful to scientists, maybe this is not the way to do things. Maybe you want to build models that are by design understandable by scientists. Right? So you need process for constructing models that are accurate and comprehensible. They are explanatory. They can be communicated, and they should be communicable to the human scientists. So there should be a way to have a back and forth with this machine that is generating these models, right? So yeah, this model looks nice, but it's wrong in this aspect because it did not take this thing into account that just came out in the literature today, right? So I can correct the model. If it's a black box model, I cannot do that. I can't interpret it, and so on. Okay. And we need ways of assessing these models in terms of their explanatory power, coherence with models at other levels of detail. So something that at the genetic level, I have an understanding, it should make sense at the gene network level. What I understand at the gene network level has to make sense at the cellular level. What I understand at the cellular level has to make sense at the tissue level, and so on. So you need to be able to weave together these models at different scales. So, and then you need tools for scientists that augment and extend human intellect, right? Every one of these steps that we do in science, all the way from acquiring and maintaining background knowledge, assessing gaps in scientific knowledge, formulating questions, designing experiments, and so on, right? So you can imagine a scientist assistant, right? And just one such tool. It's observing you and others in your field in the background completely unobtrusively, and learns about what you are working on and what your friends and your colleagues are working on, finds and reads the relevant literature as it comes out, right? Because there are millions of articles being published every year. You couldn't possibly read them in detail. So you need up there, locates and ingests available knowledge and data, and offers you assistance. Here's some data, you have been working on this hypothesis. And of course, this associate can figure that out because your hypothesis is represented in a digital form with a precise syntax and semantics. And then, there's some data that contradicts your hypothesis, and you should know that, right? Here are some arguments for and against your hypothesis based on what's happening in the literature. Here's some data from lab X that might explain this weird finding that you have, that you found in your lab. Here's why you should prefer, model A to model B, okay? So these are the sorts of tools that we need in this scientific cyber infrastructure. And science is inherently a collaborative enterprise, particularly now in the current era. So that means that we need support for shareable and communicable representations of scientific artifacts. We more or less have figured out how to do this for data. I mean, still it's a hard problem, but to some extent, we have figured out how to do that for data sets. But we need to be able to do that for hypotheses, for theories, experimental designs, and so on, so that we can dramatically accelerate what scientists are able to do. Okay. And then we have to go beyond these artifacts themselves, but actually take into account the human and the organizational structures and process for collaboration. So if you want to launch a project, you should be able to assemble a team with exactly the right expertise, right? And get access to the right data sets and so on. And so complicated tasks, you need management of those, and perhaps we can get tools to help with that. So this, this is a tall agenda. I mean, it's a tall order, and it means that we have to have advances in many different areas of artificial intelligence and infrastructure to support all of these. So in a sense, we need cyber infrastructure that supports this entire scientific discovery life cycle, not just the data acquisition, management, and machine learning, but all of it. Okay, so we can begin to think about this. And I don't know how I'm doing on time. We could go over a couple of examples if there is time. You're muted, Srinivas.
A few more minutes would be fine, yeah. You've done about 40 minutes, 35 to 40 so far.
Okay, so I can wrap up. So it's very hard to think about these things in the abstract. So it's good to take, a couple of concrete cases and sort of dive in. And so I can talk about a couple of things that we have been doing in this arena. So one is, an example is cyber infrastructure for healthcare, right? Health data is siloed. So there is electronic health records that are data that you get from wearable sensors, data that you get through imaging, and socio-demographic information that might have impact on your health. So you could take this and ask the question, how do you use that data to come up with actionable information? So for example, can you quantify somebody's risk of a particular disease based on not only clinical variables, but also their lifestyle, their diet, and many other things about which you can now acquire data as they are going about their daily lives, right? And this leads to many challenges. The data is distributed in silos. There might be various types of constraints on access, data use, ethical considerations, data processing, bandwidth. So you'll have to come up with techniques for dealing with distributed data, machine learning from distributed data. You might want to combine data from the environmental exposures and socio-demographic variables along with clinical data to understand the socio-demographic contributors to health risk. So for example, with the current COVID pandemic, there is general statistics that show that individuals belonging to certain ethnic groups have disproportionate impact in terms of COVID-related deaths. Why is that? Is it something genetic? Is it access to healthcare? Is it the environment in which they live? What is it, right? If you want to do something about it, it's important to understand what's causing that. And this kind of information, and you cannot do this with one data set or with 100 samples. You have to do this at scale. You need data from all around the world to be able to do that, right? So I'll skip the rest of it. I mean, similar problems in biology. So summarizing, right? Rutherford said all science is either stamp collecting or physics. And big data, in a sense, are spectacular stamp collections. And so big data is not the demise of scientific method. If anything, it underscores the importance of scientific method, because if you're not careful, you can draw incorrect and grossly misleading conclusions from large data sets. So accelerating science requires more than big data. It requires computational abstractions of both universes of scientific discourse as well as scientific artifacts and scientific process. And to operationalize this, you need cognitive tools that augment and extend human intellect, particularly in the domain of science, but one could make the same case for humanities and other fields. And collaborative human-machine infrastructure for science. For the most part, we don't understand how to build the latter. We know how to build computers. We know how to build computational infrastructure, but we don't have a really good handle on how to build computational infrastructure that works well with humans, with all their quirks, okay? Because in order to do that well, you need to have a way of modeling human behavior and incentivizing it in such a way that it works in a way that is smoothly with the way computers function. And this is a great time to be working on this because this would require fundamental advances in many different areas of AI and advances in collaborative data and computing infrastructure. So I stop there. Happy to take questions, comments.
Thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant, if I may say so. Occasionally a little hard to understand all of that you said, but clearly there was great ideas in there and a great deal to think about, and I'm sure a great deal of questions to ask. So since you need to be off in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, my suggestion is to everyone attending, and I see that we've got close to 200 people as participants now, please do ask your questions. There is a mechanism that has been set up to ask these questions. So I encourage you to use that mechanism. But as long as we get this, get this question answer session going, maybe I could start with my question first to Dr. Honavar. Would you have been happier to be born 20 years later?
I don't know. I don't think there is ever a perfect time to be born. I think it's been a fun ride so far, right? I mean, even in our lifetime, a lot has changed, and I think that would be probably true. Some for the better, some for the worse.
The rate of change, do you think it's going to get, I mean, you're talking of acceleration yourself. So is it going to get faster, or do you think it's going to be?
Well, it is getting faster. I think by many accounts, I'm not a historian of technology, but just as a layperson, reading what's been written about it, I think in many areas the acceleration is very, very is great, and and that has impact. And I don't know whether humans as a race has the ability to adapt to that rate of change. We don't know. It's an interesting thing, and how far we can do that. And if we can't, then at some point that would kind of dampen. There will be a plateau because ultimately, we have to be able to cope with it, right? So the technology is invented by us to an extent. Yeah.
I might ask one more because I don't want to hog the limelight. But do you think that with these new techniques of acceleration that you talk about, could you identify one problem which you think has a far better probability of being solved tomorrow than otherwise? I mean, it's all for some good, right? So what do you think is the best good?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a long list of problems that I would like to see solved, right? But I think human health, probably, in many areas, I think we are getting closer to understand, being able to diagnose diseases. We're getting a lot better. So, for example, recent work has shown that just a simple eye scan can reveal a great deal about your health, including whether you have diabetes and many other conditions, right? And if you can kind of push that back as early as possible, early diagnosis with non-intrusive techniques, cheap diagnosis, so that you can intervene, not necessarily in terms of pharmaceuticals, but in terms of simple things like lifestyle interventions that could have a major impact on health. I think we can do a great deal about environment as well, right? I mean, the environmental sensors are collecting data that we can, in theory, can act on. So there's lots of places where I think we can make an impact. Whether those impacts will be realized, or whether we sort of get caught up in really going after the low-hanging fruit, right? Where so whether we realize the benefits of these technologies really depends on the incentive structures that drive innovation and how we respond to it. and sometimes those incentives are not aligned with what you might consider societal good.
There is a discussant raising his hand,
Okay.
Minas. Since we have invited him as a discussant, let him ask.
Yes, yes, of
Not
course.
my question.
Yeah, we could talk about it.
Minas, go ahead.
Sure. Sir, while
Yes.
yes, sir. Thank you. Sir, while explaining the cyber infrastructure needed for accelerating science, you talked about two aspects. Some mechanism through which we choose the right scientific approach. You talked about the correlation, causation, causing some issues, and then you also talked about automating the scientific actually process using machine learning. But the real issue that you mentioned was about the false or misleading results. So don't you think this might also involve a lot of work on ensuring the data that we have is having the right context, the semantics of the data, etc., is actually there? Though we see a lot of actually efforts in ensuring that the semantic data is available, but don't you think there has to be some web scale kind of initiative to ensure that the availability of data itself is actually proper before it is used for scientific processes?
That's right. I mean, but that's one piece of it, and I wanted to make one small correction before I answer your question. So machine learning is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. In fact, one of the points I was making is that sort of blind reliance on machine learning using large data sets is a little dangerous. So because even with semantic tagging of the data and all that, right? So because there's always a story behind the data. I mean, there is when I decide to gather some data, right? I have I choose to measure some things and not others. I may choose a particular population in which so the traditional scientific process, you would design an experiment and collect data. In the big data world, the data is collected for whatever purpose, and it's co-opted for some other purpose, right? Because it's available, okay? So data that was gathered for purpose A gets used for purpose B, C, and D. And when you do that, if you're not careful, you can go horribly wrong. So for example, if you just gather a data set that's available, of genetic data set, and it's coming from a Caucasian population, and you do all kinds of analysis, you find some biomarkers and design drugs, and then you jump to treat, Africans or Asians, there is a problem, right? I mean, this is, a simple, somewhat simplified example, right? Because just because the data is there, it's sort of looking under the light, where the light bulb is, right? Looking under the light. So, you analyze that data, you have some tools to analyze that data, you draw conclusions, but then they may not be applicable. So there's lots of those kinds of issues. But what you talked about in terms of having the data with the appropriate metadata. Metadata is not, not just some tags, but really you have to, if I get a data set, I need to have a description of the process that generated that data. Assumptions, various other things. So everything that is needed to make this data kind of stand on its own legs, right? Because that's what I would need in order to meaningfully use that data. And that's not really happening at this point in time. So if you want to do this at scale, then we have to develop the tools and the methodology and everything else that goes with that.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yes.
Are there other people asking questions? Otherwise, I will ask a question.
Why don't you start? Yeah.
Okay, my question to you, Professor, is that you mentioned, of course, about so many things, AI for science. In that context, simple things such as, machine learning, AI, etc., for spam detection. It has been there for the last 20 years or so. Even my own students did research on that NIA-based, algorithm. But I mean, why I'm sharing this, just 3 days back, I had sent a mail to one of the discussants, and still, every other thing was proper. Still, it went to a spam folder. My question is, if such a simple thing cannot be managed by the existing tools, how can we trust machine learning and AI for complex things such as medical intervention and stuff like that?
Yeah, so that's a whole another talk. I had a 45 minutes, so I did not get into, I mean, even this, I skipped a lot of the details. That's a whole another talk. So, I mean, spam detection and things like that, right? One size does not fit all. Your spam might be my interesting article, right? And it may be also, even for me, it may depend on the context. If I'm sitting around on a Sunday afternoon, I might actually read that thing. If I'm busy, I would junk it, right? So these are very difficult problems. And so at the moment, what we have are, simple solutions that kind of go halfway. I mean, they may do a good job of screening things and maybe scoring them, but I look at my spam folder once a week or so, because precisely for that reason, right? They're not perfect. And so a lot of these things should not be, I mean, maybe spam is not such a good example, but certainly, medical decisions, right? They should not be completely automated, right? So there's no point in doing that. So they have to be human machine systems. So, the early part of AI, the focus was on, can we automate something? Because it was a cool thing to do. I mean, it was a challenge. And to an extent you can, okay? We haven't done that entirely, but to an extent you can. I mean, you have theorem provers. We have, machine learning is currently hard, but you can do various things. Okay, but then if you're going to deploy it in a situation where it really makes a difference, for example, life and death situation, or giving sentencing in for crime, whatever it might be, right? Then you have to bring so you have to sort of bring around this technology all of the things that you have to do in order to make it reliable. You have to regulate this technology, make sure that it, so for example, the FDA is now having discussions about when you consider software as a medical device, right? And how to regulate it, right? You have to have fail safety mechanisms, right? When you have automated driving, right? There are ethical considerations that come into play, and so on. So I think, and so if it's not going to be about automation, I think we have to increasingly think about human machine systems. We understand that part of the technology very poorly, because we haven't been in the business of building such systems for very long. And then there's the societal and ethical and all of those considerations. I mean, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it, right?
Thank you.
So I hope that that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
Ravinandan has raised hand, sir.
Yes. Why don't you go ahead? Ravinandan is one of our discussants. Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Sir, how safe are we when it comes to the data protection things? Say, like, we have already revealed so much of about ourselves in the internet world, and the thing is, even for few of people, even if they didn't want to reveal, the government has taken the much required data, and there was some loophole there as well. And the third thing is, when it comes to data centers of banks, so many big banks, they were not secured. So they were like openly available for the hackers to get in and collect data from there as well. So when it comes to big data, we are kind of revealing much more than what is required, or the big data is collecting much more required data there. So how safe are we there? Is there any
So
kind of...
not very safe. It's very obvious we're not very safe, right? So there's been case after case of this. I think it's kind of, in some ways, it's technology kind of getting ahead of society in some respect. And so you find these problems, and now we have to go and fix it, right? So, I mean, there's several ideas, and, I'm not an expert in this at all, but, just as a citizen, I have some ideas, right? So for example, I mean, there is a movement that argues for kind of basically your data is your own. So you own your data. It's not Amazon, it's not Google, it's not somebody else, it's not the government that owns your data. You own your data, and you permit somebody to use your data for a specific purpose at a particular point in time. And you can revoke that at any time. So you can imagine a world, if the society comes around to accepting this view, that you can create infrastructure that allows you to permit somebody to use your data for the purpose for which it is you're willing to do that, or not, right? So so you are in charge of your data. I mean, this idea is being played around in the case of medical data, health records, for example. Should the hospital own it, my data, and do whatever they want with it, or should I own it and let them do what I want them to do with it, right?
Yeah, so Satya has a question. Yes.
Data, unlike the research articles, are not copyrighted, which means essentially every data generated by every scientist becomes a proprietary right. Now, there can always be an argument that a lot of research data is generated by funding by the taxpayers' money. Now, since data is not copyrightable, what kind of do you think the regulatory model or community obligation models will evolve in controlling and managing the data? And in case of copyright, there is a moral obligation of the author for making it available for public good. Because data is completely proprietary, there are no such obligations whatsoever on the part of the generator of the data. Now, in this situation where data is completely proprietary, what kind of social complications it may lead to in the future? Particularly because we are talking so much about big data and betting a lot on big data.
Yeah. So it's again, I don't have a simple answer to that question, but there's some small things which we can do, right? So, for example, if it's research that's funded through public funds, then it's reasonable to expect that the data that comes out of it is available openly, right, publicly. So this has been the philosophy that's taken by the National Science Foundation and NIH and so on in the US, right? So if it's data that's coming out of a publicly funded project, it should be available. Now, if it's a private company that's generating the data, of course, and they fund their own work, then they are entitled to keep it. It's hard to force them to share it. But there are many areas where this private entities, for example, companies, pharmaceutical companies that work on drug discovery, or materials research companies that work on new materials, and so on, they have enormous stashes of proprietary data that is of some use to them. I mean, there is a competitive reason why they, for competition reasons, they keep them private. However, if you think about the public good, there may be benefits to them sharing that data in some form under some conditions, if not with the public at large, at least with each other, right? So the data about failed experiments in drug discovery are incredibly useful if they are taken along with the data from experiments that were successful, right? So I think incentive structures that would make it happen, that would be something that would be nice to see. And getting back to, I think you had another question that was sort of buried in that, which I now forget. I lost my train of thought. So if you can remind me what the other piece was. But this is, I mean, certainly an issue, right? I mean, under what conditions you want to share data, what is the incentive structure for doing that? And you have to have incentive compatible mechanisms, right? So, self-interested entities have to want to do that. Right?
Yeah, there's the privacy issue of the data. While it's
there is a privacy issue, but I mean, even when privacy is not involved, right? I mean, when there is privacy, there are, again, people working on privacy preserving ways of, computation on the data, multi-party secure computation, privacy preserving machine learning. There are many developments there. So, in some ways we can deal with that as well. And you can't expect absolute privacy, but it's a relative thing, and it may be for a particular purpose. Again, if you kind of move this model where the personal data is owned by the person to whom it belongs, right? Then there is, it's up to you what to reveal under what context, and it's.
Okay. I realize that we've already 11:35. Are there more questions for Dr. Honavar? Dr. Honavar, you want to say something at the end, or?
No, I mean, nothing in particular. It was fun doing this, and hope it was useful.
Thank you, Professor, that you were able to spare your time, especially, I know it is already 1 a.m. there. So thank you so much. And then we would let you off the hook now and then continue with our session. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Immensely enjoyable and educative.
It was a great talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
All right. So that was Dr. Vasant Honavar, who's just left. So now we resume sort of normal proceeding. That's like, back to a normal situation. So as you know, we've got 3 panelists who are going to talk. And if it's okay, I'll go in the order that our flyer shows.
Sure.
Unless we have any reason. That's why I asked Dr. Lim if he was in a bit of a hurry or something. So given that he isn't,
no problem.
May I then invite Mr. S.R.Narayanan to deliver his first talk. He is the Chief Data Officer at Trivanis Consulting in Singapore. And if I want to think of 2 key words to sort of describe his interest or concerns, I'd probably say information delivery, digital transformation. So it's over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Good morning, everyone. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we're able to see your slides, and yeah, they're looking better.
I'll talk about cybersecurity infrastructure and how people, processes, technology, and law comes into play in incorporating the cybersecurity infrastructure in overall e-signs or different multinational companies and how governments perceive it. It's partly from my experience and from industry experts. Across different industries and government, we see machine learning and AI has grown increasingly sophisticated and is being used in multiple applications, including providing superior cybersecurity risk analysis and detection. And big data is being at the forefront, creating a lot of innovations because it can extrapolate conclusions based on large amounts of data. It is often much more effective as an online security tool, along with many other cybersecurity tools. So we see commonly known different techniques how hackers are used to steal information or create some malicious impacts to individuals and organizations. Usually botnets and malwares are targeted across multiple individual users and medium to large size organizations. Ransomware, as there are many incidents you can find on the internet, it's mostly targeting government or large organization who can pay a FT sum of money. And of course, social engineering and phishing is so common and prevalent across the globe. So AI is much more effective at detecting potential threats than a human observer because it can sift through massive amounts of data in very little time. It is more efficient and cheaper to operate. AI harnesses the power of machine learning to identify potential threats and harmful software, allowing it to revolutionize the online world. So the effective use of AI can help prevent identity theft and corporate breaches. In general, experts have experienced that combining AI-enabled technology and a cybersecurity tool or metadata and policies is like 20 to 40 times more effective at detecting a security threat than just using human intervention. Because there is so much information online and so many different access points, data is vulnerable to attack by cyber criminals. Cyber actors may organize data breaches in which they steal information about individuals and corporations. They may sell this information online to others, creating almost a never-ending cycle of breaches. So there are many regulatory and compliance laws, data protection laws, which guides and enforces cybersecurity policies and infrastructure that is translated to how the business processes needs to be governed, how data needs to be governed, and how enterprise architecture needs to be governed, and how an incident management must be not just acting, proactively working on preventing such incidents.
Could you explain your, sorry to interrupt, but could you explain your color codes, because occasionally it's not clear.
Okay. So this is one of the map that shows how regulatory compliance are enforced across the globe in different nations. Of course, this is from the internet, and we can see in countries like, continents in North America and Europe, they have heavy data regulation, data protection laws like GDPR, CCPA. And in Singapore, we have PDPA, and in OJK in Indonesia, and so on. And in India, we see regular updates on KYCs, especially from banking and financial institutes. They ask for provide your KYC for credit card or just for the bank accounts for any products. So these regulatory and compliance requirements, the laws, they drive not only the small, medium enterprises, but large organizations to enforce cybersecurity and data governance policies and external reporting on a regular basis. So this brings in many moving things together, like people, process, infrastructure required, and how technology can be leveraged in terms of bringing in actionable insights. So at this junction, I just got reminded of my own incident, which Mr. Ravi Nandan asked a question, how safe we are. So I just want to share some thought or a story there. Mostly in developing countries where data privacy is less managed, hackers use authentic information to create fraudulent accounts. The account is so genuine or authentic that one would not even say that it's a fraudulent account. We may assume that cyber attacks are only for large organizations, not for individuals, but data privacy attack happens for vulnerable and targeted individuals as well. So many such incidents can be found on the internet. And my story just goes like this. More than 8 years ago, I migrated from India to Singapore, closing all my accounts and disposing of my properties. 5 years ago, randomly, I just received an email alert saying that a domestic LPG gas cylinder was delivered to my India address. I thought it must have been a typo in the email address or data entry glitch or a technical glitch in the system, and I just ignored it for that moment. And again, after once in every 3 months, I regularly got this alert update that gas cylinder was dispatched and delivered against an order number so and so. This grabbed my attention. Sitting here in Singapore, I rang the centralized customer care of that gas company in India. They denied any such account existed. Later, I did some R&D and found the mobile app of that company and did all the data mining tricks, permutation combinations to log into the account. So-called fraudulently authentic account. I was shocked to see my details are so much authentic that even the email address for alerts have not been changed. It's my genuine email address that has been used, and that's why I got awareness about what is happening there on the transactions. So 2 years back, I visited India and Bangalore, and asked that particular gas agency that has my account registered with them. They could not deny the existence of my account registered with them because I could show them on the mobile app, but they denied that any such transactions happened. I gave them a letter to close my account. They received it, acknowledged it, but to date, I continue to receive dispatch alerts once a quarter. Despite having neural network algorithms and sophisticated cloud technologies at my hand, I still do not know how to crack this. Although there is no monetary loss, but I could see that my data is being used. I could only conclude that my data is, my personal information is being used, and a trade is happening at a premium that benefits to unknown parties that are not connected with me. So, and then I realized what experts say. So please secure personal data because tax, death, and data breach can never be avoided. You can only control or mitigate it. So coming back to this slide, some of the ways how AI can help is like what we see as of now. It's not the future, it's already existing. How big data analytics or artificial intelligence, machine learning helps improve the security of the organization is continuous monitoring of the emails and user behavior. And it reduces the time taken to respond and quickly detects the frauds and intrusions. Another use case is when the data sharing happens, uploads and downloads happens, or the cloud migration happens. The cost to prevent such breaches or proactively reporting in near real time is much possible or made possible using the machine learning techniques and advancement in the data acquisition and integrations. So another such example is like messaging platforms and external meeting tools. We see some incidents like wherein the sensitive data, the key data sets have been shared, and that often goes unnoticed by cybersecurity tools. So AI is helping there in using NLP and computer vision. AI is helping them, helping the organizations identify the risk with much better accuracy, and it's operating throughout the clock. And it finds patterns that humans do not recognize. And it helps create alerts in reporting the irregularities for human to constantly feedback, yes, this is true, this is false positive, or so on. So other use cases, which is part of
I might have to request you to speed up a little bit. Yeah.
Yep.
Please go on.
Yeah. In the scanning web pages and malware detection, we have additional layers of security that preempt the attacks and warning before the harm is done. And other things that are evolving is security on the mobile devices when the company or data is being shared through mobile devices, and advancement in the antivirus that goes undetected usually. So overall, AI helps improve the productivity of the team members, focus on what they need to do on the business rather than focusing on the incidents. So AI has unlimited potential to grow. So this is a simple reference flow, or the how the metadata from cybersecurity tools are curated and how data is processed near real time to generate the insight to AI, and how constant feedback comes from the human interface. That's pretty much my presentation. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas.
Yeah. I would suggest that as per the schedule, we will go to the other panelists, and then we will return for the question answer, first from the discussants and then from the others. So it is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Ee-Peng Lim. May I ask how I should refer? I mean, would you be Dr. Lim or would you be Dr. Ee-Peng?
Please unmute, sir.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, very well. Thank
Okay,
you.
just call me Ee-Peng. That's my
Okay.
name. All right. Lim is my last name, although it appeared at the beginning.
Yeah, yes.
All right. So let
Yeah,
me.
so may I just take a minute to introduce you? I mean, the second 30 seconds to just introduce you. Yeah, so I hope I get this pronunciation right, but you're the Lee Kong Chian Professor at the School of Information Sciences in the Singapore Management University. And if I had to pick certain keywords that are close to you, I might pick smart city, smart nation, social media mining. Well, this is what I picked up, but please go ahead now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be here. And it's very special to be able to join a conference like this. And while we are still having a lot of issues in the world, and I hope everyone at the conference stay safe, and hopefully we can get through this problems soon. All right. So my name is Ee-Peng. I'm based in Singapore, just like the first speaker. And so at the university, I'm running a research center called Living Analytics Research Center. So by its name, you can kind of guess that it is doing a lot of work in the data analytics research, machine learning, and now more deep learning for the purpose of analyzing living data, right? So when we say living data, we refer to data generated by people, and as people interact with others and interact with the services, in the cities, in the both urban and social settings. So we have all this data to analyze, and we would like to extract useful insights about people, about how we could improve the living environment, so that on the whole, people enjoy a better living experience in the city. All right, so that's the beginning, and my topic today is trying to kind of look at a more social aspect of this panel discussion topic. So I would like to talk about cyber infrastructure and big data analytics for social good. So that has been a topic that I thought is very interesting. I think it's also relevant to the e-science and library communities. So I think we are now facing a lot of problems in the world. So COVID-19 is one. Everyone is suffering from this. No one is spared. So I think this is one example of the social challenges that we are facing. We will still have to find ways to cope with this. Second major social challenge is global warming. I think again, this is I think everyone agree that we are facing some climate issues. And so we still have not found a way to kind of turn this around. So this is another major. I think you can name many other topics that are important, both socially and also politically. So I think what we see here is that beyond these two topics that I mentioned, there are many others, right? For example, public health, education is another sector of topics, and then we also want to pay attention to today's information consumption, where people do not always get information from the traditional medias. They could consume a lot of online content and leading to sometimes problems such as radicalizations and such as misinformation. Okay, so So all these are interesting social challenges, and obviously we are the people, we are facing them day to day, and the government are also worrying about all these topics, and I think they have to think about how to design the right policies to overcome some of these challenges. Now, as researchers, right, in the university, what can we do, right? So are we writing papers? Does writing papers help to solve the social challenges? While we will always like to think that we are doing something good, so I think here the positive kind of thinking is that we can contribute, right? As researchers, we can contribute to social good in our work. The question is how, right? So as the topic today is big data analytics and cyber infrastructure, I think we can try to think along the line that we could build some infrastructure to help overcoming the social challenges. We can also deploy, maybe develop some big data analytics methods to help us, achieve some, let's say, try to arrive at some solution, right? So in my own opinion, I think if we have the data related to all these different social topics, we could definitely think about developing big data analytics or AI kind of techniques to extract useful insights about all these data trends and also trends and patterns, as well as some of these hidden factors that can help us understand what's going on in our society. For example, whether it's in education, whether it's in the public health. So these are insights that are important to both the government and the general public, because with the right insights, I think our government should be able to design better policies. And with the right insights, I think people would then be able to know how to cope with all these different challenges. Some of these insights could be very relevant to people, as they try to make choices, as they try to sort of find a way or find or develop their own plan towards solving their own challenge. And the other kind of the contribution that we can provide is to use big data analytics to develop smart tools, right? So insights are basically findings for consumption. Smart tools are basically solution, right? So if we have smart tools to solve problems, that will be very useful. So on one hand, we want to learn from the data what are the important findings. On the other hand, we do want to find solution by introducing smart tools. Okay, so that's the general idea. And so from the infrastructure standpoint, I think I'm trying to borrow this picture from the economics. So I feel that in the cyber infrastructures, we have to basically rely on a lot of data. We have to collect data that help us understand our environment, our society. And so this research infrastructure would therefore be will be built using of course computer infrastructure, but then now we need the data to provide the source of computation, right? So data has to be made available, and we are already seeing that many companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they have tons of data, and they are making use of this data to serve their customers, to provide better services. But on the other hand, in the case of the social good research, we have to find a way to gain access to data as well, or to collect data for that purpose. Okay, moving on. I think what I want to bring back the question to our community. So so what can we do, right, if you are a member of this eScience and library community? So what can we contribute? So I would see that there are a few points that are worth thinking about. First is about the data availability. So I guess in eScience and library community, I think there has been experience in research and also providing services that help people to gain information, right? To search for information. But I think in the past, the information that we focus on are largely books, papers, journals, and so on. But today, I think we should start thinking about data sets. Should we introduce data sets as a kind of materials that we need to maintain, to catalog, and to provide search, right? And that would allow people to find data sets more easily, and to have data that is ready for research, and for us to build smart tools. Another topic is about the infrastructure. So if we have to change our way of providing services, and we need to build up infrastructure that can allow us to gather data sets. So that will mean that maybe the future library will have to start developing crawlers that can collect data, and to be able to store this data, and even to process the data, so that we can have a clean data. We have a data that is well integrated and properly extracted, ready for analysis, and ready for us to compute. Thirdly, I think, of course, AI and big data techniques are new, right? So and it's constant, it's fast moving, right? So we need to train the e-science and library communities how to make use of this new skill sets. How do you acquire the skill sets? So we need to improve the competency. Finally, I think in all these social related challenges, it's important to collaborate in developing the right approach in extracting the insights, and also to develop the solution. So we need a collaborative relationship to be built with researchers, and particularly researchers from different disciplines. So finally, I think with all this effort, I hope that we could turn all this wonderful research that we are doing, into social good. And with this, we also hope that more researchers could come on board, right? With the ready data sets, with the properly orchestrated infrastructure, with the competence, e-science and library community members, and with the strong collaboration relationship among the researchers. I think this vision can be possible. So I think that's all I would like to say, and maybe we can have more time for our subsequent discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we will certainly come back for the discussion, but as is the process that we are following, is that we have all the panelists making their statement first. So now I would actually like to invite our third panelist, Dr. L.Venkata Subramaniam. He's the IBM Master Inventor and Quantum Ambassador. I would like him to explain what that role really involves. But yes, he's got his PhD from IIT Delhi, and he's been with IBM since 1998. Knowledge engineering. So yeah, maybe one keyword I could think of for him is knowledge engineering. But it's over to you, Dr. Venkata Subramaniam.
Hi, good afternoon. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, now.
Okay, great. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about the infrastructure required for deep learning. And Dr. Bhogle, you also asked me about what the quantum ambassador role is really about. So that's about trying to set up India as a quantum computing hub.
Not as much, yes. Huh.
Yeah, so that's what it is.
How are we doing there?
So we are collaborating with a lot of the top universities here in India, along with some of the industry partners who will be early adopters of the quantum technology.
You're hopeful?
Yes. Thanks. Okay, so I'll get back to this one. So deep learning has taken over a lot of applications today, right? So what I'm going to focus on is what is really the infrastructure demands of such applications, and how are we approaching this problem, and how do we sort of make more strides in this area? Okay, so so deep learning has two aspects to it, right? One is the training part, and the other is the inference part. So in the training part, you're giving it a lot of examples, millions and millions of examples, and using that to train the system, right? So what you need is, lots and lots of labeled data to be present, and for computing infrastructure that is able to manage such large volumes of data and use that to train deep learning systems. And then once you've trained such a system, you have to see how do you use it for inferencing. And typically today, most of these inferencing devices are small devices like mobile phones, like maybe drones, maybe automobiles. And these do not have the high compute power of, let's say, which is there in the lab in a high-end machine, right? So how do you tackle this challenge of, once you've trained using all this data and built these huge deep learning models, how do you use that model then on a small device like a mobile phone, like a automobile? And so what are the techniques for that, right? So I'll not go into the depth of any of this. I'm just going to give you an introduction of how some of this is being tackled today. And for deeper discussions, please feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so a very small primer on what is deep learning. So deep learning is really, you're trying to emulate the brain, millions of neurons, billions of connections between these neurons, and you're trying to train such systems to mimic some of the actions that we perform, which is, everyday actions. It could be things like driving. It could be, a doctor or a radiologist making classifications on images. It could be, in agriculture, various applications are there today. And that trend is accelerating because we are seeing that more and more data is available, more and more compute power is available. As a result, bigger and bigger deep learning models are getting constructed. So here are some examples. AlexNet was the first one, 2012, which used, I think, 1.2 million or something images to do image classification. That was the first system which showed that, deep learning can use huge amounts of data and it can perform large tasks like classification on images and things. Now, if you look at this, the AlexNet has 60 million trainable parameters. VGG has 19 layers and it has 138 million trainable parameters. So you're seeing that, more and more of these deep neural networks, not only do they have, large number of layers in them, but which also means that, there are several trainable parameters in them, which also means, they require millions and billions of training examples to train these to perform at a accuracy level that is very high, right? And there are several applications which are already there, so medical oncology, where doctors are using, these deep learning systems to make help them in recognizing or, diagnosing diseases. It is being used in agriculture. In the next 3 years, it is expected that, there will be some, fruits and vegetables which will be touched for the first time by a human when you are buying it in the supermarket. That's sort of the level of automation and the advancement in deep learning that we are talking about, which means that, whether it is planting the seeds, whether it is watering this farm, whether it is plucking the, the fruits once they have ripened, whether it is, stacking them into the truck, whether it is the truck driving itself, all of that, we are looking at a level of automation, which means that, you require these systems to, one, work at very high levels of accuracy, and two, at a level where they are completely autonomous, without any human intervention. You've built the system, it goes online, that's it. We're already used to a lot of chatbots, Siri, Google Talk. Many of these are already there on our phone. And many of them also use, deep learning systems to work. And then, of course, the autonomous cars, right? Autonomous cars already they are, so the Google car has a license in California. A lot of these, advances mean that, in the next few years, we are going to see more and more of these applications, working at a level where human intervention will not be required for several of these. But how does this happen? So what you have is, a deep neural network with several layers. You're learning all these parameters, you're defining a loss function, and you're using some, optimization function like gradient descent to actually do this. And to do that, what that means is, several matrix multiplications, large matrices are getting multiplied. That's one of the most complex operations which is being performed here. And to do that, a lot of GPUs are getting used, simple GPUs, hundreds of simple cores sitting there in, in these, whatever server farms, where they are, processing these floating point and whatever multiplications, thousands and billions of these, right? So that's what's happening at the back end. And to do that, there are several other things which take place. You're trying to speed up, or you're trying to, use half precision, you're trying to auto-tune some of these operations. You're also, trying to take care of the IO challenges, because what is happening is when you have these billions of images, even the input and output becomes a challenge, because what happens is, as you read and write, that's the overhead. The computation is happening fast, but the read and write is actually taking you a lot of time. So things like prefetch, storing it in the memory, distributing it, all of those are some of the techniques which are being used today. And as I said, I'm not going much into the detail. I'm just sort of outlining all the challenges and talking about how they are getting solved, since we have a very short time here. But just to get you to appreciate that, in the deep learning system, which has these several thousands and of tunable parameters, as we just saw, actually millions, we are looking at several layers of complexity as you try and scale these computations on the GPU machines, right? There are also, memory considerations, because not all of it can fit in the memory. So you have to look at, how do you tackle these issues when it comes to the memory issues, in terms of how do you store the raw data, how do you, store the intermediate computations. So all of those, are the major challenges that you're trying to face. And then, once you have trained this model, as I said, these models are not going to run on the servers that you trained them on. Often it's going to run on edge devices like, mobile phones, or a car, or a drone, or a satellite. So each of these, are constrained by, the weight, first of all. Secondly, the memory that is there, the compute power, and also the battery. Because if you run a lot of high level computations on these, your battery is going to run out in a very short period of time, right? And of course, because of the cloud, some of these computations get run on the cloud. Complex or large computations get run there. Some of the easier things get run on the edge devices. But even that, the handshake between the high-end device and the edge device is something that you need to take care of, right? So as I said, energy, bandwidth, compute power, weight of the storage and memory, all of these issues need to be tackled, and these are getting tackled, in fact, in a lot of the devices like smartphones that you're looking at these days. and a lot of the other things like autonomous cars, drones that are able to make decisions on their own. So in all of these, a lot of these considerations are already being taken care of, but this is an area of research where people are looking at how to do this more and more efficiently, because as I said, in the next few years, you're going to see even more adoption of deep learning in various applications that range from, as I said, autonomous cars to things like medicine, retail, agriculture, and all of these applications. So I'll sort of stop here, because
Yes.
we're getting here into the techniques. You're getting into how do you get the edge devices to handle some of these big computations. So we do things like model compression. You take a actual, model, and then you see how do you compress it while making sure that, the accuracy does not scale down too much. You're reducing the size of the model, but you don't want the accuracy to go down drastically. But I'll stop here, and in the interest of time, and I'll encourage any of you who's interested in learning more about this to get in touch. I'll be very happy to discuss with you more and go into the details also. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I wish we could have gone on, but we are going to have lots of opportunities to interact when we start the question answer. So once again, as is the established practice, I would first like to invite our discussants to pose their questions. We have 3 discussants. So which of you 3 is going to pose your first question?
So Minaj has raised the hand.
Okay, yeah. Minaj, can you go?
Sure. My question is to Mr. Narayanan. Just to set the context of my question, I would like to actually mention 2 incidents or 2 examples. Nidhi Razdan, who is a very senior actually journalist associated with NDTV, was a victim of phishing recently. And then the other example is Logo Kit, is becoming very viral off late, wherein it is simplifying the phishing attacks on the fly. The pages are being created and fooling people to respond. So that being the context, you mentioned about AI emerging as a solution for solving cyber security issues, right? And in that context, you talked about some governance frameworks. So what I feel is, if you talk about governance frameworks like say COBIT or HIPAA, etc., and if you interface that with AI ML, to some extent, it might help them to solve the problem. But how is it going to help me and you as individuals? In what way you think AI can help in solving cybersecurity issues of individuals? You can kindly throw some light on that.
I can answer this from multiple perspectives.
Sure.
One is physically we need to have perimeter, very secure perimeter to protect our own data. It all starts from there. If you ask any cyber expert, they say that first have you secured your premises or your own data. The sophistication keeps adding layer by layer, from individual to a larger group to a larger small to medium enterprise, and then to large organizations and government bodies. So as a steward, every single person is responsible to hold their own personal data as well as the sensitive business data, and that's a community. Individually, once your data is in e-form, there are multiple tools available to protect your data and prevent any way of transmitting to other parties, and also your usual antivirus, malware, your browser security features. It starts from there. To of late, you have DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS. So there are multiple layers I could think of, right from individual to larger corporates.
Yeah, that might be to bring in some sort of proactive measures to protect. because particularly you talked about AI being employed. So from a research perspective, just trying to understand in what direction can we look at if you really have to bring in AI for protecting cyber security of individuals?
All right. So if you want to take a research perspective, I would recommend some specific tools, data, and you can start from the most basic one like Wireshark, Nmap, understand how those networking. We start from that basic networking tools, network tools, and see how the data is transmitted, how we can I would say apply some pattern recognition or irregularity, anomaly detection on how that data in a group or a corporate level being passed on in the network, and can the other tools which are currently existing in the market, be it anti-malware, anti-virus, that often captures more than 90% or 98% of the threats, but there are still 1 to 2% of those threats that are going unnoticed. So often, or I say this is a trend where some of the research students are taking some plunger, and you can come up with some hypothesis, understand the metadata, come up with some governance model, understand existing governance model, and carry on some good study there. Does that help?
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Who will ask next?
Dr. Gunjal is there, sir.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, actually, my question is to again Narayan or Ee-Peng. In case of big data analytics, actually, as we know, there is a recommended systems which are coming up in the use of ontologies for representing the knowledge, similar knowledge in knowledge discovery, where it helps in recommendation systems based on the user interest. Might be, as we see, one of the any one particular subject, one video if we see, similarly the similar kind of other interest videos will be popped up in the Facebook or YouTube. In similar to that area, even in case of ResearchGate and academia, when we try to search any one particular paper on any one particular subject, so similar things comes up in ontologies. So my question is to how the ontologies play a role in these kind of as an advanced technology in these kind of tools, and whether they are adopting any particular standards, because from system to system it differs in the recommendation systems. This is my question. Thank you. Any particular standards have been adopted so that like for example ResearchGate or academia, it will show some relative information, but that may differ from system to system.
Yeah, maybe I could try to answer your question first. Well, I do not work on the ontology research. I think you're referring to ontology standard. But I believe that there are quite a lot of researchers spending a lot of effort to standardize the representation of ontology. And I think, so sorry, I need to, sorry. Yeah, so I think there are some effort in standardization. I would encourage you to kind of refer to some of these web-related standards, and I think there are a lot of efforts are related to web as well, because a lot of ontologies are to be shared on the web. So it's closely related to the web standardization. And yeah, I think in terms of the use of ontology to improve search and recommendation, it's already a very active area of research. Maybe the way people sort of call this area of research is different compared to before. Instead of using ontology as instead of using the word ontology, most of the people today are using the word knowledge graph. So if you are looking for the use of underlying background knowledge, right? Whether it's ontology or whether it's in the form of knowledge graph, you should look out for work, in the space of a knowledge graph based, for example, recommendation or search. There are even use of knowledge graph in answering questions. So question answering is also a very important area today. And so how do you answer questions, especially complex questions, correctly? You need underlying knowledge to help you find the answers, to help you process the unstructured data in order to extract the right answers. So I would say that, yeah, there are a lot of research going on now, making use of knowledge in the form of knowledge graph, and I would say that it's the today version of ontology. All right, yeah, maybe we should get the rest also. I mean, anyone else wanting to contribute?
Yeah, I'll just add that, the typical standards being used are the OWL standards. Um, that's the standard which companies are using, primarily because there are several tools available that can handle those standards. But as Professor Ee-Peng also pointed out, the semantic web community has always been happier with not using ontologies but using triples. So they convert the the ontology relationships into triples, and because triples can be much faster in terms of processing. You can process triples, read, write, all those things you can do much faster. People tend to prefer using, the semantic web community especially prefers to convert all the ontologies into triples and then use it. But as you pointed out, for example, in recommender systems, whether it is Amazon, Flipkart, they all create these huge ontologies. But ontology by itself does not solve the problem, as we are realizing more and more. And deep learning techniques have brought in a lot of power into it, where you're able to combine neural techniques with knowledge based techniques, right? So today neural techniques do not typically use a lot of knowledge, so that's a good area of research where you're trying to combine knowledge with neural techniques.
Yeah. Someone else wants to answer, or
can I go with the second question?
You want to do it right away?
Yeah.
Okay,
so
please do so.
Yeah, this is related to the cyber infrastructure. Maybe Dr. Venkat also can contribute to this. As we know, in spite of using the advanced technology and also like investigation team who works in the cybercrime cell, we normally come across, they really face a lot of challenges in finding out the cases. Maybe, for example, in case of risk management of the banking sector, maybe identifying fake transactions, and also the identifying fake activities or email IDs sent by anonymous people. Even though the IP address, everything can be tracked, but why this cyber cell people do face a lot of challenges. One the recent is, again, when a nation is moving towards the digital payment towards that, but even then we sometimes as an users we feel that insecure to go ahead with making the mobile payments. So my question is, in spite of using advanced technology, why the cyber infrastructure or the cyber crime cell people face a lot of challenges in these kind of activities? Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Venkat, you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So see, there are three problems in this. Okay, the first one is data. The number of good transactions is billions. The number of fraudulent transactions is in hundreds or thousands or those, right? Now, as you know, learning based techniques require lots and lots of data. So what happens is, when you're trying to train a system, you don't get enough of fraudulent cases, okay, to train your system. The second way you can do it is, you can come up with rules. You say that, okay, if somebody transacts every day, he transacts only 10,000 rupees, and today he transacts for 1 lakh rupees, that's fraudulent. Now, those kind of rules, no matter how good an expert you are, you will never be able to come up with all the combinations of rules, right? And that's why we go for data-driven approaches. But in the data-driven approach, as I said, there is the challenge that, the number of proper transactions versus the number of fraudulent transactions is always going to be totally imbalanced. So you're right, this is a challenge to be tackled, and people are looking at it. It's really a tough problem, because you're looking at a graph which has, in a day, there are, if you look at UPI, I think crossed 2 billion transactions a day, right? Or some such huge number. Now, if you are talking about taking each of these transactions and putting it in the form of a graph that I transferred to him, he transferred to somebody, so that becomes a huge graph. And that's a graph processing problem, which again, is a research problem. There are multiple problems here, but I just tried to outline some of the simpler ones for you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
That okay? Yeah, okay. So shall we ask Ravi Nandan to pose his question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
My question is to Dr. Lim. Wherein there was a debate even long back, wherein open access initiative was there, and people used to write their papers, even though professionals, academicians are writing, there was a question of quality there. So when it comes to big data or wherein we are gathering information from the social world of internet, so how far is it reliable? How is the quality assessed? Because so many common people with knowledge or even without knowledge, they discuss so many things and come out with different things. So how is it tackled there actually?
I think obviously there are two kinds of data. There could be data contributed by institution or organization where you probably will expect the data to be a bit cleaner, and maybe they have been properly verified, and yeah, so that would be more reliable for research use. And there are other kind of data that you could gather from the online world. And so here I refer to examples such as Twitter data, for example, let's say Reddit and several other online platforms. Such data obviously would have a very different kind of quality. But that's because you're seeing data generated by many different kind of people. There's no one institution, right, controlling the quality of such data. But on the other hand, much of this online data are also basically telling us about what people think about what they really how they really interact with others, and also and how they may behave, right? So in the online world, I would say that even though they are very noisy, they may not carry high qualities. The language people use are not necessarily formal. There are lots of I would say lots of words and spelling errors, that you, I mean, wrong choice of words or whatever. I mean, some of these local slangs will be used. But nevertheless, having said so, I think that precisely those kind of noisy data precisely could be the research it could be used for research, because maybe at times we want to know the way or a community of a user express themselves, right? So take for example, I say in the United States, right? I mean, you will have a group of people supporting a particular politician. They will have a certain style in expressing themselves. You may regard some of the expression as not very high quality if you try to measure against the scientific evidence. But then, no, that is the way they express themselves. That's what they believe in, and it's still important for us to know what they believe in, right? So as to have a better understanding of how maybe we could engage this community of users. So I think we should try to be open open-minded as we study all this data. I mean, so maybe for your own research interest, some of this data may not be the right kind because you are looking for something else. But if you have the interest to look at particularly the kind of characteristics that the data can provide you, the peculiar characteristics, then you could find the data set very useful. But I think, having said so, I think the problem now today is that most of us will have some difficulty gaining access to such data, whether it's online data or whether it's institutional data. And so a lot of our effort, right, in research has been devoted to collecting data. And I can see this happening every day. Our members of the research communities spend a lot of time collecting data, cleaning data, and then we are just repeating a lot of effort again and again. So I think we could have helped each other by maybe sharing the data, right? Organizing the data, and also to use whatever infrastructure we have, particularly in the university library, for example, or maybe in some of these research institution that has the means to maintain and curate the information about the various data sets and share them in a appropriate manner. Of course, that's my wishful thinking. I mean, it's not easy to achieve. So maybe this is the short answer to your question is that, yeah, I mean, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So you have to appreciate data set, the particular data set that you want to use in order to find it to be a treasure to you. All right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so maybe now we have a session of open questions so that our discussants also can make up their mind about their next question, if there is to be
Dr.
one.
Mira has raised her hand. Could you please allow her?
Yes, please come.
Dr. Mira,
can you come on? Can you unmute yourself and?
Yes.
If we can see you as well, yeah.
In fact, it was a very nice session listening to all the experts on various aspects of cyber infrastructure and various issues. Now my question is to Venkata Subramaniam. You have very nicely explained to us with beautiful examples of deep learning techniques, but application of deep learning techniques is, I feel, maybe more appropriate where a lot of precision is required. Perhaps something like while launching a rocket or something like that. But one of the examples that you gave us was of from the field of agriculture, where you mentioned that everything, right from getting planted and up to the delivery, everything gets automated perhaps in a couple of years, where human power is mostly involved. Human force is largely involved in doing all these kinds of jobs currently. So what would you think this will have impact on the society in the years to come?
Yeah, I think the societal question is always a tough one to answer until we have actually gone through it. Right? Because, I mean, we had this question 20, 30 years ago as to, if computers come, what will humans do, right? Because the same question was asked in the bank. There are so many, staff now. Once the computers come, what will happen? But it is inevitable. We have seen this throughout history. We have seen that, all of us might not like computers or mobile phones or something, but we also cannot live with it. Okay. So I think it's inevitable. Whatever the way research is going today, the way advancements are happening, it is something that's going to happen. And we then need to figure out what is the role for us, whether our farmer has to look at other things like distribution. If you look at India, right, 1 acre of farm is managed by, 3 or 4 people. In the US, 150 acres is managed by 1 person. Okay. So, you know, we cannot stop technology from moving forward. Even in a place like India, because I understand where you're coming from, right? The question comes because of the challenge that, you know, most of our, you know, labor today is sort of working at a level where they're using their hands and eyes and everything, right? Now, if we are talking about technology that's going to do all of these things, how do we sort of tackle it, right? So that you know, if you look at the cricket example, right? uh, DRS was opposed by the Indian team for several years. Okay, you know what the argument was? The argument was that, you know, the computer is the DRS system is not 100%. It makes errors. Do you know how many errors the umpire makes? The umpire makes in LBW decisions about 4 out of 5 are correct, 1 out of 5 are wrong, which means the umpire is about 80% of the time right. We do not ask these questions of humans, right? So that level of acceptance, it's happening, you know, it's happening. We're all using mobile phones, we're using Siri, we're using several things. And you know, yes, that gap between rural and urban is all there, but I think it's only a matter of time before we find other things to do when these computers start taking over some of these things.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have some more raised hands?
Minhas has raised.
Yes, Minhas.
Okay, so this is your second discussant question. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, this is to Dr. Subramaniam. Sir, first, if you could please clarify on one point. In response to one of the questions from one of the discussants, you mentioned that industry prefers using triples instead of ontology. So are you suggesting that there are two different things? Because when you talk about ontology-based knowledge bases, you're again storing data in the form of triples, right? So how is it different actually? And why do you say the preference is more towards the first one and not ontology?
Yeah, so an ontology is not just the easy hierarchy, right? It doesn't mean that I'm the son of my father, he's the son of his father. That's a very simple relationship, and those kind of relationships are excellently, you know, captured by triples. Okay, the triple will say, you know, Venkat, father, son. So these are the triples there, right? But the difficulty comes when, you know, the ontology has, an ontology is supposed to be rich. It is supposed to not only have father-son kind of parent-child relationships, but it's also supposed to have, you know, much deeper relationships, like saying that Venkat uses his hands in this fashion, whereas his father uses in some other fashion, you know. So those kind of relationships, which are very unique to some of the nodes, and the relationships which are there, you know, now you can have a relationship between one node here and a node somewhere else, you know. It just need not be connected nodes which are, you know, in a hierarchy, right? Like a inverted tree. So what happens in such cases is that as you try to capture these relationships using triples, you're not able to capture the intricacies of the relationships, the complexities, or the, you know, the kind of reasoning that you can do on top of these things gets missed out when you're doing it using triples. Triples are fast, but they miss out on certain deeper kind of relationships. Whereas ontologies are slow, but they have very deep relationships. But the problem also comes that, you know, you can create millions of triples, but the kind of deep relationships you need, you know, several experts sitting together will only be able to create maybe 1,000 nodes in 1 year, right? So there are all those, you know, scaling versus size, all those challenges are there. But my point was to that complexity issue when I mentioned triples versus ontology.
Sure. Well, this was just a clarification. I have one specific question. When you talked about deep learning, all said and done, it entails a very sophisticated infrastructure, and setting it up, be it on-premise or on the cloud, is going to be very challenging. So institutions or, as I told you, research organizations, etc., even if they have to really leverage on deep learning, it's going to be really difficult. So what we get to see is just, something like small neural nets and things like that. So your experience in that domain. So can you please throw light on what kind of resources can we really look at to leverage on, the vast knowledge that is already available for using deep learning or for doing some sort of deep machine learning?
Okay, maybe I should try to answer this question. I guess if you are a researcher, you probably worry about how do you carry out your deep learning research, right? With the available computing resources you have. Yeah, indeed, it's a very high cost to be able to gain access to that means high performance computing systems in order to do deep learning research and to develop a deep learning based solution. So you need to find a way to pool resources together, right? So for example, in our case, so my research center has a fairly I would say we are fortunate to have a fairly good computing infrastructure. So we have so far acquired a few the NVIDIA DGX server, which is designed to support a lot of deep learning kind of research. And so it's possible when we have several faculty members, coming together, pooling our resources together, so as to buy expensive machines that are also shared among us. So I think you need to think not as think about use the acquisition of computing infrastructure not individually but basically in a collective manner. So you have to pool resources together in order to achieve this. Yeah, I mean, there's there's no good solution here. I must say, if you really want to pursue this deep learning research, you have to and you want to do it in a sizable manner. So you have to scale up your research. You have to find a way to gain access to such sort of high performance, this GPU based kind of computing systems. Yeah, my advice is to basically talk to others and find a way to gather the money together to buy such machines. You can start from one. Once you have got results, my experience is that interestingly, if you have delivered some interesting outcome and some result, some other people will be willing to invest. All right. So then you will slowly grow. I know, and this is my own experience. So we bought the first GPU server several years back. After producing some results, we realized that more people are interested. They pull in. They started to provide more support so as to allow us to buy a second one and so on. So I think you have to do it incrementally. All right. So start from one. Try to find a way to get one first, and show some results. Right. So do not try to just get a machine and just leave it as a toy. You have to seriously think about generating some interesting results or finding some developing solutions. Right. So I think that's my experience. Right.
Venkata is back now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe he has his own experience from the industry.
Yeah. So on this, in the 2000s, if you remember, India suddenly, all of us, at least I went to an NIIT and learned some C programming and stuff, and then I could readily get into a job, right? So that we got on the IT bandwagon very, very seamlessly as a country in the 1990s. Okay. Because the entry barrier was very, very low. I could go learn programming anywhere and start doing it. But today in AI, my fear is exactly what you said. I can learn programming online. I can learn Python, I can learn all those things. But to run my code, I need those high-end machines. And sadly, even some of our top institutions, IITs, ISC, have limited access, in terms of the number of students who can use such machines is much lower. So my fear is we should not, miss the AI bus. The way we caught the, the IT thing, we were on the spot, we caught it and we sort of led it. But AI, because of this infrastructure need which is there, the government, universities, all of them need to invest in this, because there is a lot of interest. Every kid today wants to do something in AI. They reach out to us, saying, I want to do this, but compute is a major challenge, and that needs to be fixed. And like Dr. Ee-Peng said, we can start small. You can start by, joining Kaggle or something. They give you some compute there. You can use some of the free cycles. That's one way to start. And for each one of the people here to start writing code in that, I know everyone knows Python today, but it's a matter of getting access, which is not there. But like Professor said here, there are means. So just go and try and use some of those compute.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we are running out of time, but we still have some time.
If there are no others,
can I ask one more question?
Can I ask a question? Srinivas, can I ask a question?
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, the question is to Dr. Subramaniam. IBM introduced a product, launched a product a few years ago, based on developed based on deep learning in the medical field. That is Watson on cancer diagnostics and treatment advisor. I think that was more like an advisory service on diagnostics and treatment of cancer. Can you explain, particularly to our audience, what all has gone behind, particularly in terms of the type of content that has gone in, how the content is organized and structured for querying to get appropriate advisory results on diagnostics and treatment?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take a stab at it. So there are three aspects here. One is the textual aspect, right, which is the patient reports, diagnosis reports, lab reports. All of these have textual and numeric data, right? The second one is where you have images, right? Images of MRIs, and the third is you also have text plus image, where you have an MRI and then a radiologist gives a report at the bottom saying, there is a lesion there, there is a, something here. So these are the three types of data, right, which you need. And as we all know, in deep learning, what you need is lots and lots of examples, right? So what you have is doctors who have labeled saying, in this image, this is where the cancerous tissue is present. In this image, this is where the cancerous tissue is present. So in a purely data-driven approach, what it means is you have these millions of cancer images which are already labeled. You're running it through a deep learning system with the answers marked, and the deep learning system is learning the weights so that when you show it a new image, it is able to label it and give it to you as a, here is the cancerous tissue present in this new image, right? So that's really what is happening in the back end, which is in terms of, providing lots of examples to it and getting that output. Now, the challenge which is there in something like medical is deep learning systems are black boxes. They do not explain that, I'm saying that this is cancerous tissue because this is the way I reasoned about it, right? Which is, if you go to a doctor is able to say why something is cancerous and why something is not. He's able to justify that, this is cancerous tissue because the cell size is, dilated, it's like this, it's like that. And they're able to give a justification for it. In a very simple setting, for example, if I take the example of Flipkart might recommend a red shirt to you. But if you ask the deep learning system, why are you, recommending a red shirt to Venkat, it will not be able to give you a justification saying that I'm recommending a red shirt because, in the 2 months back, he bought a red shirt for himself. And then 3 months later, he bought a red dress for his daughter. That kind of explanation is missing in deep learning systems. And as a result, adoption of Watson and all of these technologies, just like the DRS of cricket, is going to take a lot of time and effort, because we're always going to say, oh, but this Watson is not 100%. It will never be 100%. No human is either 100%, right? But in terms of answering your question, the data is organized in the form of labels given to data, and those labeled data sets are then passed through deep learning systems to provide the output. The challenge has been in terms of explainability of those deep learning systems. And that's again a matter of research where we're trying to figure out, how do we provide the kind of reasoning which will convince the doctor saying that, when the system is saying this is the cancerous tissue, it is actually correct or it is wrong. So that's
So, in IBM Watson for cancer diagnostics, I understand that they also have used Medline database in the backend. How is Medline database structured and integrated into the whole system?
Right. So Medline, along with there are several cancer or ontologies also, you might know, right? So there are these ontologies which organize saying that, if it is a lung cancer, then these are the carcinogenic, agents, these are the things. So there are several ontologies also present in the cancer domain, right? Now, you take a Medline paper, what you do is, you extract all the entities which are there, you map it to the ontology which is present, and then you try and, create some structure out of it to say that, when this, this is the diagnosis. Because what happens is, a lot of research papers is where the latest things are coming out, right? Somebody says, I tried this drug and it helped reduce the cancerous tissue in the lung by this much. That you'll only find in a Medline article. Now, to extract that piece of information and put it into Watson, you're using that ontology, you're using deep learning techniques to extract entities from there and to populate whatever databases you have so that you're able to pass it into your system.
Okay, so it's actually 1 o'clock, but I see that there are 3 questions.
Dr. Shalini has a question, please.
Okay, I didn't see you. Okay, please go ahead.
My question is to Ee-Peng, because he comes from a computer science background but worked in the digital library area. So he understands some of the things that our audience, majority of them are from the LIS community. And we have been saying that, research data management or research data curation, etc., is one of the new frontiers for library science community. So my question to you, you did mention, you talked about RDM, etc., but your own university experience in RDM, how far are they? What is the involvement of the digital library community in the RDM space?
So yeah, I think the RDM is becoming a part of the library functions these days. In university library, we have a team of librarians setting up a repository of research data sets. So there's also university policy so being implemented to get faculty members and researchers to basically put their data sets in the repository, and to provide at least some simple metadata about these data sets, and also to identify what are the research papers that have been created or have been published, right, related to these data sets. Now, this is going. I do not I mean, it's a good start, but I don't see that it's a very fast, growing kind of repository, because this is just an effort from a small university. So I think for this to really scale up, we need more libraries to join in, and we need libraries to also work more closely with one another, and find a way to share this data set curation, and to share the effort, right? So that you do not need to repeat some of this effort, right? Now, for example, right? So the SMU researchers could be contributing the data sets, that they have collected to the library in SMU, and Indian University could also, do the same to their own faculty members, and collecting data sets and so on. And then we could then expect that among the university libraries, so we could have some arrangement to help each other, find the right data sets, find the right the publications, using the data sets. And I think that will help a lot, in getting the researchers, to find the right data to conduct their research. So I think it's a long way, but we have to start somewhere, right? We have to start also standardizing the practices, and to create the right engine, for example, to find data sets, and to also search for publication relevant to data sets. So that's my initial thoughts right now. Yeah, I think if we have interest, that there's probably another discussion to find the right policies, and also to create the right systems. Yeah.
We have a session on research data management because you combine the different fields. I thought I would ask you this question because you also referred to that. Okay, thank you.
One question is how deep learning helps in the library services.
Maybe I can try. I think because I'm familiar with library research, I would think that there's a lot of deep learning that we can do to integrate library services with learning. So while the university professors are teaching, making use of their own content, I think there's a lot of interesting content in the library that also could be useful to the students as they try to understand what's going on in the class. So can we use deep learning then to find the relevant content, particularly to integrate, right, the content covered in the classroom with the content that is available in the library. And in this way, I think we could bring students to access the library more often, and also to perhaps to find other ways of these similar concepts and some of this theory being presented in different ways, by different in different books and in different kind of materials. So that's my quick suggestion for answering this question. Yeah.
And the last question is there for data protection of small enterprise. What skills should be employee of that enterprise possess? How do we select the employee upon his skills?
Let me take a stab at it because I come from the industry background. I would go with the first principle thinking, and because cybersecurity is very vast area and there can be specialization in multiple facets, I would ask a person to start with the fundamentals like networks, and then if possible any certification on the cybersecurity and compliance or audit functions. And then on top of that, they can build layers with respect to security code of practice, or get familiar with multiple tools like CyberArk, CyberStar, and some processes and the business mechanisms to handle the security incident responses. These are things I could think of, and also the mobile security and forensic on devices, multiple OSs, multiple operating systems. They have their own specializations, and there are different cybersecurity experts. Whenever there is an incident, it's not that one person can solve all the problems. It's like they have always, the cybersecurity team always work in a network. They know people in their network and they call each other for particular specialization. So that's what I would think for someone who would start in cybersecurity. That's what I see at least here.
All right. So do we say it's over?
Yeah, we have covered all questions in Q&A box, and whatever hands were raised, all were answered. So successfully, all these questions were handled by our panelists.
On my behalf, I'd like to thank all our panelists, discussants, and the keynote speaker. I think 2.5 hours sort of flew by. So it's really wonderful and great initiative from informatics as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.